Screams in the old hospital. Last summer, my friends and I went ghost hunting at an old former hospital in our town that is said to be haunted. When I was in a paranormal research team a few years ago, this location was one of our favorites, and we've had so many experiences at this place. But the one I'm writing about is now by far the scariest. The way the old hospital is set up. People are allowed to walk up and investigate the first 3 floors, but the 4th floor and up are off limits, and you can get in serious trouble for trespassing charges. The first 3 floors have been fixed up so that they are presentable, but all of the higher floors are completely and totally abandoned. There are still wheelchairs and hospital equipment just laying around up there. When I was there with my friends last summer, there was 5 of us in a group. It was me and my friends, who I'll call Zane, Rose, Edward, and Michael. We were all on the 3rd floor, the highest floor we were allowed to go up on, and Zane decided to run up onto the 4th floor. We were all telling him not to go up there, that he would get arrested and that we would all be guilty of association, but he didn't listen because he wanted to see if he could capture any evidence of ghosts on the creepiest floors. Rose and Edward decided to stay at the bottom of the stairs and wait for Zane to come back down, while me and Michael walked away through the door and down the hall, not wanting to be involved in this whole situation. As Michael and I were walking, we continued on our ghost hunt. We were filming things and listening closely to them. After several minutes of silence, we suddenly heard a muffled, horrific scream on the floor above us, which was the floor where Zane was. And it sounded like Zane. The scream sounded so tortured, like someone was in seriously intense pain. I instantly was chilled to the bone. Michael and I started freaking out. My first thought was that Zane had fallen down and gotten hurt up there or something like that. We ran back down the hallway and through the door in a panicked state, asking Rose and Edward where Zane was and if he was okay. They had no clue why we were freaking out so much. Michael and I told them what we heard, but they said they didn't hear a scream at all. We spent the next few minutes calling up the stairs to Zane, texting Zane, messaging him on every social media, but got no response. We later found out that his phone had died. Just when we were about to go up there ourselves, Zane came down the stairs, saying it was creepy up there. Michael and I said he scared us to death and asked if he was okay. He was confused as to why we were so freaked out, and we told him what had happened, what we heard. He got really creeped out and said he didn't scream, and that he didn't even hear a scream. Zane is a pretty chill guy, to be honest. None of us had any reason to believe that he would have been lying about something like that. Also, Edward and Rose didn't hear a scream either, and I think the fact that Michael and I were the only ones who heard the scream couldn't mean something. Michael and I went back to the spot we heard the scream and tried to record to see if we could hear anything else, but it was completely silent. We all continued on our ghost hunt, even though we were pretty shaken up by the whole situation. That day, we only had 2 other minor paranormal experiences. We heard singing when no one was there, and we saw a door shake by itself, but the scream was by far the creepiest thing that happened. Old Copley Abandoned Hospital. Old Copley used to be a city hospital back in 1886 and boasted 25 beds. Of course, by the time they closed in 1996, they moved to a much larger facility. It had grown considerably, almost swallowing up the original Queen Anne 3-story structure, despite the original part being declared a historic site. They, the city, are pushing to demolish it. I can't say I blame them. It's been neglected for a long time now. It sits just a few blocks from where I now live, and I walk past it often. Of course, it's also rumored to be haunted. I feel a sentimental attachment to it. Both my children were born there. I always pause walking past it, sometimes walking up to it. I feel bad, I guess, for it. All those years of service, all that history, and all it's getting is a wrecking ball at some point. There's been a few paranormal teams, at least that's their claim. I really don't know how legitimate they are, and multiple urban explorers who've trespassed into Old Copley, claiming to have experienced things. Voices, apparitions, a doll that moved on its own and such. They may have, I'm not really sure. Once, right around dusk, I had a fairly bad scare. Standing in front of the large doors looking inside, I could see someone approaching the door. I stood still, wondering if it would materialize into a clearer image, or if it was someone just trespassing. The glass itself was dirty, and it wasn't very clear. The image appeared to be reaching out to me, a heavy hand on my shoulder. I rolled about, almost losing it, before I realized there was a cap. It took me almost 2 seconds for me to grasp what I had really seen was his reflection in the glass approaching me from behind, and not someone coming towards me. I felt relieved and stupid all at once. Of course, he wanted to know what I was up to. No trespassing signs all over the place. I told the simple truth, just stopping for a memory. He must have found it funny to almost give me a heart attack, because he was struggling to contain a chuckle that, and I'm about as intimidating and threatening as Shirley Temple. I'm not saying the old hospital isn't haunted, because I think it is. However, it's been so long before their doors ever closed. Back in 1981, I was there to have my first child. I ended up having an emergency C-section. After the effects of the anesthetics had worn off, I was sitting up in my bed, debating on calling the night nurse. I was incredibly thirsty, but I paused because I knew it was late at night. The maternity floor itself was very, very quiet at the moment, signaling way past visiting hours, and most were actually sleeping. Since my older sisters are retired nurses, I have a healthy respect for the profession. Did I really want to disturb them for something so mundane? Someone should be making rounds soon. Maybe I could wait until then. Right about then, a nun came into my room. Even though there's a Catholic church literally on the corner from the hospital, I was a bit surprised that she still wore the full nun's habit, complete with a wimple and the floor-length robes. A heavy rosary hung at her waist. "Hi, sister," I croaked. She smiled at me and silently poured me a glass of water from the pitcher on the nightstand. Why can they never put it within reach? I drank it, thankfully. The nun took the empty glass and asked, "Better?" I said something like, "Much thanks," as I laid back on the bed. I was wondering if it was the lighting or imagination, as she seemed to glow a tiny bit. At any rate, her presence itself was comforting enough. She smiled again and eventually left, I assumed to look in on the others. The next day, a couple of sisters dropped by. I swear they meander the halls, and if you're alone, they eventually stop. To do something to you, I guess. Besides, maternity is about the only happy floor in the hospital anyways. They were dressed in modern outfits, more of knee-length dove gray jumper, and a simple veil as a head covering. Being the curious sort, I guess, I asked about the nun's dress from before, which got me quizzical looks, and told no one in their order wore that sort of habit anymore. Perhaps she was visiting from another city, or was from another order? Flash forward 5 years, 1986, second child, second C-section. The night nurse is an absolute doll. I think her name was Karen or something like that. Not that it really matters, to be honest, but she used to bring me coffee after hours from the nurse's lounge, and in slow times visit me, chattering about this and that. We shared some good talks at odd hours if I was awake, and she'd time. When she was on duty, I never worried about being an inconvenience. She'd pop in saying, "I thought you never rang," and we both laughed like we shared the greatest joke ever told. Sometimes we'd stroll the halls together, me hunched over like I'm 90 years old and pulling on the IV stand, and her ambling by my side. It was one of those strolls I saw the nurse again. She was coming from the quiet ward, as we refer to it. The area woman who didn't have happy deliveries finished their stays in, away from the babies and the new moms. Karen and I always turned down another corridor before we reached those doors. It was just too sad. I opened my mouth to greet the nun, but then shut it, because her head was down and she looked to be in silent prayer at the moment. I paused as she passed, and Karen's grip on my elbow tightened almost painfully, causing me to jerk my head towards her, away from the nun. "Did you see that?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper at that moment. "What? The nun?" I was confused. Nuns were nothing to be afraid of, yet Karen was clearly scared. She nodded yes, and we both turned our heads in the nun's direction. Nothing, just the other nurses and orderlies, not a habit-wearing soul in sight. Back in my room, over cups of the strongest coffee Karen could find, she informed me we had just seen Sister Augustus, or rather, the ghost of her. Long ago, there had been a horrible train wreck when a passenger train ran an open switch and collided with carboys of acid. The accident occurred in the yards 1 mile from the depot. 7 boys were playing on a car when the train, running at full speed, swung onto the siding. With no chance to escape, 2 died, while the others were more or less burned. Sister Augustus was one of the first to reach the victims and start first aid. She rode with the injured to the hospital, and despite having suffered some burns herself, demanded to go help look after them. She refused to rest or be treated until after they were cared for. The story goes that infection set in, and the good nun died from it. But ever after, there were those who claimed the nun had cared for them in some way. Empty hospital ward. I am not 100% sure this is the right place for my story, but I thought I would share it anyways. I'm also typing this on my mobile phone, so apologies for any typos that may occur. I've been a nurse for almost 6 years, including the 3 years training. I have 9 years of different creepy stories throughout this time. Now, let's face it, there was going to be some kind of ghostly encounter. A hospital is a pretty likely place for it to occur, with all the deaths that inevitably take place there. This particular incident takes place in a hospital in the southeast of England, where I completed my nurse training. I was in my 3rd and final year at this point. The hospital had decided that the ward I was on was due to be refurbished, so our ward, patients and staff included, moved to an overflow ward so that the builders could get in and do their job without restrictions. As any student nurse will tell you, we get asked to all sorts of things to help out. Some of them have nothing to do with what we're studying. However, it's all experience, I guess. I was rostered to be on placement the day of the move, which was a logistical nightmare, as we had to move all current inpatient equipment and staff in a safe way. I was asked to help with the move, which was fine by me. We managed to get the patients and bulk of essential equipment moved within a few hours' time. As the last patient was being wheeled off the ward, Sister asked me to turn off the patient call bell system from the mains, and we left. Once we had put back the bulk of stuff, we had moved down and had gotten all the patients settled, I was asked to go back out to the empty ward to fill up a few metal cages on wheels with some of the non-essentials that we had left behind. It was boring things like spare extension cords, paper, and stationery supplies. Each ward is cross-charged for these items and has a set budget, and any information on the display boards. As I walked into the empty ward, I had this sense of anxiety, you feel me? I was creeped out. There wasn't a single person on this ward except for me. The ward sister was coming up to meet me in the hour to help move the cages, and boy, did I ever feel totally alone up there. After about half an hour, I pretty much finished up and was just putting the last few bits and pieces into the cages, and we're by the nurse's station when a patient call bell went off. I almost shit my pants. I'm sure you guys know how they work, but just in case, each patient bed space, side room, and toilet and shower room has like a call buzzer. Once it's activated to let the staff know the patient wants us for something, and there is also an emergency buzzer that gets pulled usually by staff when there is, yep, you guessed it, an emergency. This was just a normal patient call bell that was going off, but as I had been the person who turned it off as the last patient left the ward, I was freaking out. Instinct took over, and I had to go and see if I was actually needed for something. Not so shockingly, there wasn't anyone there. I reset the buzzer and waited outside the ward for my sister to go back up and meet me. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait long at all. I told her what had happened, having a good working relationship. She took me seriously and told me if I didn't want to go back into the ward, I didn't have to. But of course I did. I didn't want to let them down. We had to walk to the end of the ward to get 2 mobile computers. As we walked, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind us, but I didn't want to sound crazy and mention it. The sister then turned to look at me and mouthed, "Can you hear that?" And when I nodded, We sped up and got to the computers out there pretty fast. We went to move the metal cages. We heard what sounded like a wooden walking stick being hit against the old-fashioned radiators in one of the side rooms. I had lost all my nerve at this point. The sister was brave enough to go and have a look, but the room was empty and the noise stopped when she walked inside. We spoke about it afterwards, and neither of us felt threatened in any way or like we were ever in any danger. It seemed more like they were having a little fun knowing that their noises were no longer being drowned out by a bustling ward or being mistaken for a patient. Creepy entity at abandoned hospital. So, I posted this over at Reddit The Truth Is Here a few days ago, and figured I'd post it here as well, since people seem to find it an interesting experience. This happened when I was a senior in high school. Some friend and I were looking to liven up a boring Saturday night, and decided to sneak into and explore an abandoned naval hospital in our town. A friend who decided not to go in drove us to the side of the grounds where the old barracks were located. There, we snuck in on our bellies, under a gate, and planned to exit through a small hole we found at the end of a road on the other side of the grounds near where we had parked. We walked around for probably around 20 minutes or so, and nothing remarkable happened. We found some old medical equipment. We got scared by a deer that was roaming around. Nothing crazy. We'd had our fun and decided to head up the old road to the small hole in the fence, when we noticed that someone was walking down. Our first thought was that it was security, and we were about to be in big trouble for trespassing in this, private property, but as it got closer, we realized it was anything but. The figure itself was dark and moved slowly. It was pushing what looked like an empty old flat shelf cart, which made a very creepy creaking sound that I will never ever forget. Since our only other option was running back towards the hospital, we, at that moment, had no choice but to keep walking and walk past this figure as we came right up next to it. We all snuck a glance. It was just black. No features or anything, just a figure. Black figure. Not once did it turn to look or acknowledge us. My friend screamed, and that's when we all took off running through the hole in the fence, without ever looking back. Once outside the fence, we were all shaken up and tried to rationalize what in the world in which we had seen. Someone suggested it could be a homeless person, but A, there is no way that cart would have fit through the hole, and there was no other hole in B. This hospital was on top of a steep hill, and basically not an area homeless people usually venture out to, so we realized that was a fairly unlikely scenario. We got in our cars and left, and as my friend and I drove down the hill and past the hospital, all the lights in the car, inside and outside of it, flickered off and on, off and on, off and on again. She stepped on the gas and we got the hell out of there. I slept with the lights on for 3 nights after that. It's been 7 years now, and I would say this is still one of the creepiest experiences in which I've ever had.